privileged or stereotypical congressmen decide how bad they're going to punish these sex workers. With huge misogynistic public voter incentive, we are uncertain and unclear of why exactly it's going to protect the best interests of sex workers. There are going to be three things in my speech. First, how the regulations are going to be set badly. Second of all, the implementation process is specifically harmful for the sex workers. And third of all, why the criminalization is bad. Starting with the regulations will be set badly. We want to first start with the incentive analysis of what exactly will be setting these sorts of legislations. We think there are two actors. First of all, there are more likely to be very privileged congressmen who don't exactly know the scenario and the concerns of the sex workers. So when they're setting up this laws, their prioritization is more likely to be their own paternalistic and misogynistic incentive instead of to protect the best sex workers incentive. And second of all, we believe that in most of the countries who are imposing these sorts of regulations, there is a very strong social narrative against sex workers in the status quo. What does it mean? Because A, women in society whose husbands are going to sex workers are highly against these sex workers. And second of all, there are religious communities and churches who are against them. And third of all, there is just simply a misogyny culture even between younger women. So we're saying the overall voting incentive is very unlikely to pass legislations that are actually protecting the best interests. And it also lacks the public incentive to build out the infrastructure to actually increase the access of more HIV tests. So what's the impact of this? The impact means that the industry regulations are more likely to only have two characteristics. Firstly, it's very likely to be paternalistic, and second of all, it's very likely to be extremely punitive. And we believe that the examples will eventually fall into the examples of Turkish and Greece, and it's very unlikely to be implemented in a good way in the developed countries. Because we're saying that the benefits is quite symmetric on both sides if you want to implement in this very liberal and protective environment. Because first of all, in this environment, there is already a huge feminism pressure, so even without these certain regulations, the sex workers are likely to be protected by these communities and this kind of activism group. And second of all, we say these support communities already have enough charities to back them up, so they don't necessarily need legislative and new regulations to impose them. So in the end, we believe that these regulations will end up having an outsider perspective. So when you are having concern or when you are having some sort of backlash, or when you are feeling unjustifiably treated throughout this process, your voices are unlikely to be appealed to the higher court to be heard from a larger perspective. And second of all, it's very likely to have huge sentences and very, very long imprisonment process. And third of all, the prison they're allocated are more likely to be deprived of privileges, deprived of material conditions, are likely to be very terrible and includes lots of possibilities of sexual assault. So now let's move on to the second issue in this debate, which is why the regulations implementation process will also be carried out badly. So who are going to carry out these regulations? We believe that the large proportion is police. And we are saying this huge discretionary power during the entire process actually opened a huge door and entirely introduced the possibility and the necessity for sexual assault when they're actually committing and conducting this kind of task. What does it mean? It means that A, when you're checking the physicality and the physical status of a certain sex worker, for example, you have an excuse to see whether or not you have a certain disease. So what's the impact of this? The first impact is that you probably will force them and make them take off their clothes because you want to check their physical status. We believe that first of all, it opens up a huge discretionary power whenever they want to access it. And second of all, even though police doesn't have the bad incentive, the mere characteristic of how this process is going to be carried is initially enough to amount to sexual assault. And second of all, I think is that when you are carrying out this conducted process, when you're having this investigation process towards the sex workers, you're put into an isolated place for police officer. So this entire process of how you're implementing these regulations don't have a third-party checks and balances and don't have surveillance. It's also very unlikely to have CCTV or camera because you simply don't want to be recorded during the process you're taking off your clothes. And thirdly, it also have a unique coercion in this scenario because we're saying that the complete checks and balances has a huge discretionary power uniquely on police in this scenario. So they're more likely to say, if you sleep with me, I'm more likely to help you to get away with this kind of situations. So especially in these third world developing countries where there is huge police corruption, for example, in Latin America, in the status quo, we're seeing this unique coercive power will actually amount to huge amount of sexual assault that won't happen outside affirmative. So what does it further mean? Is that the second layer of analysis under this argument is that there will be a completely echo chamber and a power vacuum for police officers, which means that they're completely lack of accountability. What does it mean? Because A, even if they get sued, even if they get appealed, even if they're brought to the court because of sexual assault during the process, police has a proper justification for it. They can always get away with it by why this sort of regulations? Because they have the legislative incentive to get away with it. And second of all, the huge power in a cemetery joiner process, which means that there are no possibility of sexual assaults being uncovered. And third of all, because of the huge public stigmatization, imagine you brought into the court with this kind of like highlights on a newspaper. You're very unlikely to receive huge public support, and the court is unlikely to do decision in your favor. And thirdly, let's talk about why criminalization will be bad. So first of all, I think there will be a generally decreased amount of legal prosecution. As we've already told you, you have a power vacuum between the police. And second of all, we've already told you that why there will, second of all, we simply believe that there is no contingent legal principle to back up this policy. What does it mean? In the status quo, you never criminalize someone just simply because they get HIV. You never criminalize someone just simply because what is according to the info site. So we are saying there isn't a contingent principle. So this is principally unjustified to impose criminalization and sentences and punishment on them, specifically given the scenario we've already proven to you why these regulations are likely to be very punitive. And second of all, we are saying what is likely going to be end up is that these prostitution agencies are likely to be avoid policing check because there are the huge uncertainty and discretionary power of police. What does it mean? It means that huge prostitution centers are likely to be broke into very smaller groups. And these very smaller groups are especially and disproportionately vulnerable in the prostitution industry. So because when you're conducting in a smaller group, you don't have a strong community to back you up, and whenever you feel a situation where your clients want to rape you, or you just simply have healthcare concern, you're very unlikely to have the supportive services that is currently existing when you have a huge prostitution center. So finally, let's do I want to do an actor analysis of what exactly these sex workers look like. Firstly, they're more likely to be underage girls. And second of all, when they opt into the process of sexual industry, it's probably already their method of last resort. Why does it link back to this topic? Is that firstly, the huge financial penalties you're imposing to them after the criminalization is probably unbearable for them. So it's more likely to force them into doing more extreme scenario, for example, drug dealers, and they're more likely to commit pattern crimes or etc., which actually increase the crime, increase the possibility for them to do even more wrongdoings clustered up together. And second of all, you give them very, very long criminal sentences because of the misogynistic legislative incentive, which means that in their life, their entire life is more likely to be fucked up. And thirdly, so the prisons they're more likely to be allocated to are more likely to be first, women prisons, and second of all, prisons with very bad material condition. What does it mean? It means that A, you have no rehabilitation program, and second of all, you have massive sexual assault and massive bullying in these kind of prisons, so which means that your life will just ended up in the prison with no incentive and with no social mobility. So third of all, we want to talk about a scenario of domestic violence, mentioned it in the info slide. So we're saying, let's say married people, the reason why they go out is because they cannot live in their original family. But right now, if you criminalize them and bring back to their husband, we believe that even though you're not thrown into prison, you have a huge humiliation of your original husband, which means that there will be a huge possibility of domestic violence and this perpetrator in the long run. So for all these reasons, I've never bothered to propose.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First alternative gives us some really great reasons about why lawmakers really do not like sex workers and why lawmakers are things like incredibly misogynistic. That means the comparative in this debate, when you don't have any forms of these legislations, is just that sex work itself is criminalized. That means it's every sex worker that is facing these punitive punishments. That means it's every sex worker who is facing jail time. That is way, way worse on affirmative side. On our side of the debate, when you ensure some form of regulation, even if that regulation is bad, even if that regulation aligns with quite conservative social norms, that at least means it brings sex work itself in line with the social norms of these conservative countries. That is the foundation you need to ensure these sex workers get more protection and regulation in the future. That is something you can never access on side affirmative. A few things in this debate. Firstly, on setup, what just do these protections look like? Of course, in the info slide, these protections will look like things like regular counseling schemes. They could look like licensing schemes where you need to prove that you are over 18 before engaging in sex work. They will not always be the extremely punitive regulations that affirmative just solely characterize in this debate. And yes, in a lot of cases, they will just depend on the norms of the country, but at least in the comparative, it will provide some extra protection because one, at least sex work itself isn't criminalized, but two, there will probably just be it will just like align with basic work health and safety, things like that at the very least. Onto my substantive. Firstly, why is sex work just extremely distinct from other forms of work, and as such, why must it be protected in quite unique ways? Note we make the analogy to other industries that have industry-specific regulation. For example, nurses have mandatory regulations about when they must take breaks to ensure they don't collapse on the job. So it means it's important to protect industry-specific regulation when it's needed. A few reasons for this. Firstly, sex work is just incredibly emotionally laborious. Why is this true? Firstly, sex is just an incredibly intimate act between individuals, and it's also traditionally associative with extremely emotionally heavy norms. For example, it's associated with romance and love. And importantly, even if the sex worker doesn't associate sex with these norms, their clients probably associate sex with these norms. So when the sex workers engage with their clients, that means they still need to take over those similar forms of emotional labor. As such, if we can ensure any forms of regulation around protection among these just increased amount of emotional labor, note this is things like traditional counseling, which can help people handle this increased amount of emotional labor that they receive. That's just a huge, huge benefit that we can get on our side. But why is sex work just also incredibly violating of individuals' privacy, and as such you need greater protections? So note, even if the sex worker has consented to the violation of privacy that is inherent within sex work, by engaging in sex work consensually, the fact that they sacrifice such a fundamental right to wear your body, like choosing when your body gets to be seen and with whom, means that we need to give them a lot more protections to account for that. But also thirdly, sex work just is a lot of the times actively dangerous. Like sex workers are often alone with their clients, they get, especially in countries with quite conservative norms, they get seen as someone willing to do anything by their clients. And also sex work has just, in the perception of society, been heavily associated with things like crime. The impact of all of these is that they should be extended protections that go beyond general health and safety. What are some things that Team Affirmative says in terms of like protecting sex workers and their outcomes in this sense? I just want to mention one quick thing when they say how this will be regulated quite badly, because they say it will be regulated by the police and that will cause immense harms on the sex workers. One, just note the comparative. If sex work in extremely conservative countries just remain criminalized, that means they will just interact with the police in much more pernicious and coercive ways. But also, we would note just in other forms of regulation, the police does not regulate other industries. The police does not regulate the nursing industry. The police does not regulate other industries. So it's unclear why the police would be the regulatory body for sex work. We can just establish a regulatory body for sex work, like is done among every other industry with industry-specific regulations. That comes over all of these harms. That comes over a lot of those harms that Team Affirmative wanted. Next, in this point, I just want to give an important piece of framing. Many of these sex workers just do not consent to entering the industry in the first place. For example, you have things like sex trafficking, or you have people who cannot access other forms of work. For these people, we should try to make sex work as safe as possible. These regulations are a certain way to get steps towards doing that. Also, why will these protections just be useful? The key reason for this is when countries pass this legislation, even if Team Affirmative claim these countries are heavily conservative and misogynistic, they are at least likely to implement the most basic protections. This is things like proof of age. This is things like mandatory breaks or mandatory licensing programs. These regulations are essential forms of protections for these sex workers, and that has huge impacts for their protections. This means that you don't get like minors engaging in sex work, probably like sex work companies need to prove that they aren't employing minors or things like that. They may say they're like okay, so why do then these laws protect sex workers socially? Because a huge part of their claim was that these laws punish people, these regulations punish people for things like being HIV positive or things like that. So why, even when these laws are quite punitive or are quite bad, do they provide important social protections? Though this is extremely engaging with the main bulk of their case. Few reasons for this. First, the types of countries where laws restrict the agency of sex workers in the ways that Affirmative Team characterized are just likely to be quite conservative. Why this is true is because sex work just has really bad reputations. It's perceived to be immoral by the country's norms. They could have norms like sex is meant to be performed between a married couple, things like that. As such, individuals in these countries, when they feel that sex work itself is an immoral industry, now feel compelled to do particularly abusive actions to these sex workers. And as such, as Tina further categorized, there will be quite little public good for protecting these sex workers. But when we give the most basic forms of regulation, even if this regulation is quite punitive and quite bad, it brings the industry of sex work itself into line with the social norms of these conservative countries. And as such, when you apply, as such, you're just far more likely to get future improved conditions for these sex workers. Because when sex work is no longer seen as an inherently immoral industry, when sex work is seen as an industry that regulates for the worst moral harms that these countries have, you're just far more likely to get greater public sympathy for sex workers, greater public support for the industry. That is the key foundation you need to build future regulation for sex work. That is a key public foundation that you never get on side affirmative, because they give you no reasons on why you actually get a lot of public sympathy. They tell you, oh, you have like support groups and like support charities for these sex workers. Obviously, the ability to get legislated regulations for these sex workers is way, way more impactful. What are the impacts of this point? It's just in and of itself, we give a health protection for women in dangerous circumstances. For example, in a conservative country with strong marriage norms, just like now we should just not allow these married women to go into sex work so they do not get the immense harms of these countries. And also more broadly, we just get the goodwill to ensure the legitimacy of the industry. We ensure future protections of sex workers. So happy to oppose.
A lot of other industries, because it's incredibly informal, it is street-based, and it tends to be a matter of last resort for a large number of people. We'd cite the fact that large numbers of prostitutes enter the industry before they turn 15. We would cite the fact that, for example, in India, the Hijra third gender community is disproportionately likely to be part of these communities. That means there are a lot of people who need to rely on sex work. Regulation was not enough. If you are trans and you need to engage in sex work in a country where you cannot be a trans sex worker, you will do it anyway. You will be regulated by the police. If you have uncurable HIV and that is the only way that you have to make money, you will continue to do sex work, you will continue to be locked up, you will then throw away the key. This was incredibly important framing in this debate, because sex work wasn't nursing, sex work wasn't education, and sex work wasn't health, it was sex work, and those fundamental differences in the structure of the industry meant that a regulatory system would never work. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly, deal with the question of setup, dealing with how this regulation functions and whether or not these same countries would be likely to ban them in the first place. Then I'm going to talk about the direct harms that are likely to accrue for sex workers, and then talk about the long-term consequences of this. So firstly, on the question of how this is likely to be set up, we tell you from the beginning that the way these are likely to be set up is incredibly punitive and incredibly paternalistic, meaning that for the vast majority of cases, this looks like examples given in the info slide, like Greece, like Turkey. We also say that if it is likely to be done super well, it's already going to exist to some extent. That is to say, if you're in a country where they're offering really high quality counselling and really good HIV testing, it's probably you're in a system with a very good public health system. So it's probably likely that they already had access to these in the first place. If you're in a country where people respect sex workers and you're likely to treat them particularly well in these systems, you probably already had enough feminist pressures that meant you already had things like charity. You also had a large number of individual incentives to actively seek this out. Having HIV is bad for business as a sex worker because a lot of John move up between them, and you probably have connections with other people in the community. You don't want to make the rest of your friends sick. You all probably also want treatment if it is available to you, and you don't want to have face the wrath of some random guy who happened to get HIV for. It was really weird that you weren't likely to seek this out in the first place. What is their first push in this? They firstly tell us that, they're likely to access it in the first place because brothels and pimps are likely to stop the use of charities. This was weird because, first of all, the same business incentives apply to brothels. If HIV testing is accessible to you, brothels will probably try and get you to do it anyway, especially if it was available externally. Second of all, these charities are likely to be particularly good. A lot of them tend to do things like be anonymous, and that was very important, which meant that brothels and pimps were likely to rely on them in a meaningful way. What is their next push? They say, oh no, it's going to apply to an employer, and so it's likely to be good. First of all, given the framing I already had, where it's incredibly informal and street-based industry, it was unlikely why you were able to automatically connect it to your employer. There are likely to be large cultures of silence, which means that during the small groups or privately. So because there was unlike a lot of other industries where there's a corporate structure, it didn't exist for a large number of sex workers, and so it was likely to punish them specifically. What is the last push me here? They tell us that you're likely to establish a different regulatory body. This was incredibly wrong because, first of all, once again, it is street-based, it tends to be quite informal. That means the regulatory, the people who are engaging with them have to be people that are on the streets, therefore it tends to be people like police department. And second of all, because of the fact that sex work in a lot of ways is considered to be a socially taboo industry, it was unlikely you were likely to have that. The point at which you could set up a different regulatory body, it was likely to be unfunded for all the reasons we give you, and therefore police were likely to be used anyway, and so it probably was going to be used in a large number of cases. Moving on to the second part of this kind of world-building clash about why banning is probably not going to happen in a vast majority of cases. We would say there are economic incentives, which mean that if you have a large informal sex-based industry, it's probably unlikely you're going to fully ban it. The response to this is saying, oh, well, if you have a large industry that's really important for the economy, you probably want to treat them well. We would say that people, unlike nursing, where people are value their contributions, we would say sex work is different because people are just don't really care much about their mental health. And it's unclear for a lot of people, especially in politics, why we have to preserve the mental health of sex workers from being able to do their job because of the fact that there's incredible deprioritization. Second of all, we say that a lot of these groups want to protect them, so they don't have to have outwardly really bad incentives, but still treat sex workers in a particularly bad way. It was unlikely that these subset of countries was likely to resort straight to banning. There was still a subset of people who were likely to accrue harms on the opposition side. Third of all, we say, unresponded to, that discrimination against different types of sex workers tends to be quite specific. That is to say, if you hate the idea of a trans sex worker, or you hate the idea of a married sex worker, it doesn't mean you necessarily hate the idea of all sex workers. That means that the ban was unlikely to be able to be extended in a very meaningful way. And fourth of all, using their own mechanism they try and give you on backlash, we would say it's far more likely that a full ban is able to create a far amount of pressure because of the fact that it exists to a large amount of groups. You don't rely on backlash against trans sex workers, which is unlikely to get the same steam and popularity as other movements. At the end of that, what do you know? You know that the regulation they're likely to set up has to be controlled by the police because of the nature of the industry. A large amount of cases, it will include being punitive directly to a sex worker who the structure of the brothel was unable to protect them. And you know that in cases where these regulations were going to be implemented well, that was likely to be a number of cases where the alternatives were still likely to be quite protective of them in the first place. That means, even if you buy the idea that some countries will ban sex work and that would be bad, it was likely to be a very small subset of countries who were able to get a large amount of benefit for the middle countries. To the extent to which they actively hated them so much to ban them, it was also likely that the regulation would be a quasi-ban anyway, so it was unclear what the specific harm of that would be. So, moving on to the impacting of this. First of all, we tell you that the way this is likely to work includes things like increasing the ability for police to surveil these groups and to have particular amounts of leverage. They say, oh, you can get protections of sexual assault things. That does not respond to the idea that having to do a general check is something that has to happen and is inherently sexual assault. It also massively means that the scale of harm from there is unlikely to be perceived particularly well. We also tell you that if you have to be secretive, because you still do need to rely on this industry, if you are a trans sex worker, a married sex worker, or an HIV positive one, you're unlikely to be able to work in a group. The judge will probably want to have more anonymity and therefore be able to do things like not tell a large amount of details about themselves. Makes it very hard to follow up. Noting also this makes their lives far worse because of the fact that this tends to be a last resort, tends to be a financial penalty, and all the other harms we accrue under their side. Lastly, I'm going to deal with the fact that they try and push that in the future, even if it's bad now, it's likely to be reformed in a meaningful way through responses. First of all, the reason why sex work is taboo is not because there's no regulation, it's because people don't like the idea of selling your body for sex, and that means it was unclear you were likely to massively shift the social stigma, able to get that in the first place. Second of all, that's contingent on the regulation being particularly good to be able to have a meaningful shift, to be able to have a large amount of respect. Third of all, that logic is quite strange in the first place, that is to say, not everyone likes things just because they're regulated. They had to do far more work. Third, neg is too late. At the end of this speech, what do you know? You know that sex work is an incredibly specific, incredibly unique profession. It was a profession where large amounts of people in power had really poor ways of interacting with them because they thought they were better, they thought they were paternalistic, and they thought they could be punitive, especially to smaller subsets who were particularly disenfranchised. That meant that a regulatory system meant that the police had more access to these sex workers. Even if regulatory bodies also had access, the people doing the dirty work were the police. The people doing the general checks on the streets were police. The people actively discriminating against people in what profession they can work for were police. That was damning for them, because you could never trade off the life of a trans sex worker when the last option they had was when they had to do in secrecy. They had to risk going into jail for 5 years because of Affirmative, proud to affirm.
Let's be clear about what sex work looks like. Because sex work does not occur on the street. It does not occur in this informal way that the opposition wants to talk about. No. Where sex work occurs is in brothels. That is because of a few major reasons that we tell you up and down the bench that has not been responded to by the opposition. That is to say that insofar as you need to hide the ability of you to hide the fact that you are doing it, that you are doing the sex work given the stigmas that exist that both sides agree on inside this debate, is therefore more likely that you are not going to want to put yourself as a face to try and get different amounts of different clientele to you. Therefore, you by necessity have to go to a brothel. But the second thing is just to note that in brothels there probably exists a significantly larger amount of sex work for you to do. There exists a significantly larger amount of sex workers with you. So, given that that was the framing in which you probably ought to believe happened inside this debate, the majority of occasions, there are two themes that I'm going to deal with in this debate. First is what happens in countries that are particularly conservative, and second, what happens in countries that are particularly liberal. First on conservative countries, because it feels somewhat uncharitable what the opposition has claimed will happen inside these conservative countries. If you don't do these laws, probably nothing will happen to, inside this. We think the alternative is clearly probably you just ban it inside these countries. Because, just empirically, it is probably true that inside a lot of these countries it is already banned. The only alternative to be able to get some sort of sex work in this time is to legislate it in this specific way with this happening. But the second thing is to say that all of the material that the opposition brings about how this is incredibly stigmatized, about how politicians are probably incredibly patriarchal, about how they're probably incredibly conservative, about how they can do things like scapegoat individual types of people to try and get overall bans on something as an entirety, probably means that you ought to believe that this was going to be a ban. But the thing that the opposition rested their case on as to this not being the alternative was this theme of economic benefit. But this again is contradictory to their own case, right? Because they tell you that a significant amount of the time this is done in secret. Necessarily, that means that the economic indicators for how much money is made in this sector is necessarily not available to the government because it is an informal sector, right? Because it is in brothels, or even if you want to believe the opposition characterization, it is done informally. But secondly, if it is true that there is a stigma inside of this debate, it is genuinely unclear what the scale of this sex work happening inside these countries is likely to be, and therefore it is not a significant economic benefit. That is the most likely alternative that you ought to believe in this debate. So, given that that is the most likely alternative, I'll deal with the other alternative in a second. Why is this so much better in our world than the opposition's world? Because police are just infinitely better than the alternative of criminal gangs inside these places, right? Because criminal gangs are significantly more coercive, because they can just be we can at best, your escape mechanism is going to the police and perhaps getting caught, right? But at worst, you can probably just coerce them and be so we have your entire financial autonomy on our hands. We probably have you in this incredibly secluded environment inside of these brothels. You're probably a poor person, potentially an intersectional poor person, and therefore you can probably just be look, if you don't do this, we will do very bad things to you, which I'm probably not going to viscerally provide visceral imagery of, right, inside this debate. Okay, so the alternative is the police. And yes, the police are not perfect, but let's be clear about why they're significantly better. Because a lot of these policemen inside, or police people inside these countries are not necessarily bad people in and of themselves. They're just self-interested, right? The major reason why a lot of these police do bad things or do these kind of things is for money such as bribery, right? They're not necessarily bad people in and of themselves, and you best believe that a significant amount of them probably aren't going to try and prosecute these sex offenders to the same extent. And then the second thing to note is just they're probably more interested in the people that are creating this greater scale of this sexual trafficking or this kind of thing. So they probably need to some extent work with you, at the very least, even if you didn't believe that, to try and catch other people inside of these brothels or those kind of places. And as we say, absolute worst case, we would so prefer that someone goes to jail and has some ability to escape this terrible life, which is probably likely to get them killed inside these conservative countries, than the alternative. That's why we definitely win in the circumstances where our country is specifically incredibly conservative. Okay, let's go on to the other case, where it's a particularly liberal country. Opposition have a few claims inside this debate, but the most important thing to frame here is that the majority of these sex workers engage in this in a way that is particularly non-consensual. A, because of the financial incentives that the opposition themselves give to you, especially at second and third speaker, right? Of like, they probably need this money a significant amount to be able to survive. Second thing though, is just like a large proportion of the time these people are just literally uprooted from poorer countries to become part of like these brothels inside these countries. Third, like the opposition did a lot of work here to prove why it's probably non-consensual. Noting that, it is probably true that inside of these brothels, or inside of these places where the sex work happens, it is probably a very bad environment to be, right? Because if you don't have this kind of stuff, you're probably likely to be overworked. You're probably likely to have to continue working when during your sex work you have been hurt, when you or something like that. To some extent, or even you probably just have to work longer hours without getting the specific regulation that we propose on our side of the debate. Note here that these are the countries in which regulation that is particularly good is likely to occur because there exists already these feminist narratives. Note, however, that it is particularly unlikely, insofar as they prop charities as something you can do to get HIV tests, that becomes significantly better on our side of the house, because it is true that a significant amount of the time these brothels have an incentive to not let you go, not want you to go to these charities, because it provides an escape mechanism for you, because you can try and get support from those charities, right? And they want to continue to be able to financially or otherwise coerce you, because you act as a piggy bank for them to get significantly more money. That necessarily means that it was probably better inside these liberal countries that you got an ability for the police to come in and look at these kind of things. Let's look at the final push that the opposition make here, which is about intersectionality, and there exist laws in lots of places that affects trans people only, and that being really bad. Let's have a look at the alternative here, right? Because as we tell you up and down the bench, these places are places which have incredibly harsh social norms inside these places. If you are in a lone place with this person, after you and you are a trans person, the possibility of you potentially being attacked is so much greater than that occurring inside of inside a police station or somewhere like that, especially inside these liberal democracies, because even if you didn't believe that sex work isn't exactly the most long-term solution, given that as you become unattractive, you don't have a specific amount of career prospects into the future, and that was why we were so proud to again